China slapped an additional 15% import tax on American farm products.
And I think Xi Jinping is getting ready for a fight with incoming President Trump.
A global economic shockwave is unfolding, and it took just one move from Beijing. China has just unleashed a retaliation so massive that it's rattling Wall Street, sinking major U.S. brands, and leaving top CEOs begging for a way out. While some media outlets downplay it, the numbers don't lie. This isn't just a response, it's a calculated strike aimed straight at the heart of the U.S. economy. As Washington scrambles and Trump doubles down, the question isn't if this will escalate. It's how far China is willing to go. Behind closed doors, America's most powerful industries are panicking. And one surprising sector has been hit harder than anyone predicted. This is not just another trade dispute. It's a full-scale economic showdown with global consequences. Stay with us, because what you're about to discover will change how you see the next decade. China expands its retaliation playbook. While the U.S. managed to secure last-minute agreements with Canada and Mexico to stave off incoming tariffs, the standoff with China raged on with no such reprieve. Beijing doubled down by announcing targeted tariffs set to hit American goods starting next Monday. These include a 15% levy on coal and liquefied natural gas, and a 10% tariff on crude oil, agricultural machinery, and large engine vehicles, altogether impacting roughly $14 billion worth of imports. While smaller in scale compared to the total trade volume, the selection of these goods suggests China is aiming to hit sectors with both economic and political sensitivity. In its official statement, China's finance ministry slammed the U.S. for what it called a unilateral violation of World Trade Organization rules. The ministry emphasized that the tariffs would not help solve the U.S.'s domestic challenges, and instead would undermine healthy trade relations between the two powers. This sharp rhetoric signals a hardening of China's stance, framing the U.S. moves not only as unfair, but also as self-sabotaging. The statement also hints that China sees this dispute as more than just economic. It's about maintaining global norms and influence. The antitrust probe of Google by the State Administration for Market Regulation of the People's Republic of China must have added fuel to the fire. The timing of the investigation a few days after President Trump announced a 10% tariff suggests that this might very well be a tactic to apply pressure strategically on Alphabet. While the company derives only a small portion of its revenues from China, it finds itself caught in the crosshairs of a complex and uncertain situation. This probe might start an episode of larger repression against American companies operating in the Chinese market, further complicating business relations and increasing regulatory risk. Beyond tariffs and tech, China has flexed its muscles by implementing export controls on rare and strategic materials such as tungsten, tellurium, and molybdenum. Materials are critical for electronics, military hardware, and renewable energy components, among other products. Beijing further strengthened these moves by adding companies like PVH Group and Illumina to its unreliable entities blacklist, effectively crippling these companies' operations in China. Such actions show China is broadening the retaliatory playbook, moving beyond tariffs to economic coercion through regulation and resource controls to apply pressure on multiple fronts. But Beijing wasn't done. What came next sent shockwaves through an industry America once thought it dominated. U.S. tech takes a hit. The U.S. tech industry has taken a direct hit from China's retaliatory sanctions and export bans, with semiconductors at the center of the storm. After the U.S. imposed sweeping export restrictions on Chinese tech firms, most notably cutting off advanced chip supplies to companies like Huawei and SMIC, China responded by blacklisting key American semiconductor companies from public procurement and infrastructure projects. In May 2024, China officially barred Micron Technology from supplying chips to critical industries, citing national security risks. This marked the beginning of a broader shift, with Beijing encouraging state-owned enterprises and private firms to replace U.S. chips with domestically produced alternatives. The impact on American chipmakers was immediate and severe. Micron, which previously generated over 10% of its revenue from China, saw its stock drop sharply following the ban. Other semiconductor firms like Intel, Nvidia, and AMD faced growing uncertainty as China signaled it could expand the blacklist to include more U.S. suppliers. According to the Semiconductor Industry Association, SIA, China accounts for roughly one-third of global chip demand, making it a critical market for U.S. tech. With this access now under threat, industry leaders warned that American dominance in semiconductors could erode if geopolitical tensions continue to escalate. China, meanwhile, is doubling down on its self-sufficiency strategy. China has attacked a $1.4 trillion tech development plan, pouring in more cash to help its domestic chip industry. SMIC, Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, has considerably escalated its fab capacity. The announcement of a 7nm self-developed chip in Mate 60 Pro to be out in 2023 by Huawei shook the balance in the global tech community. This move was meant to show China's significant strides in stepping up to bridge the technological gap through the back door of legacy and mid-tier chips used across smartphones, automobiles, and industrial devices, amongst others, in defiance of the U.S. sanctions. The rippling effects from a likely technological disengagement are already being felt along the whole global supply chain. U.S. companies with chip and component manufacturers and customers in China have begun to feel escalating costs, production delays, and investor anxiety. Meanwhile, Beijing has enforced export control on rare earth elements, including gallium and germanium, which are essential for chip production. Hence, U.S. and European tech comes under more pressure. With the ongoing escalation in the tech war on both sides, the global semiconductor industry is in a whole new era of fragmentation, putting great demand on companies to re-engineer their supply chains, diversify production, and prepare for long-lasting volatility. China's national champions surge. Amid intensifying trade tensions and U.S. sanctions, China's homegrown tech and manufacturing giants, often referred to as national champions, are rapidly rising to fill the void left by American firms. Huawei, Xiaomi, and BYD have emerged as dominant players across key industries, once led by U.S. brands like Apple, General Motors, and Qualcomm. In 2024, Huawei unveiled its Mate 60 Pro, powered by a domestically produced 7nm chip, developed by SMIC, defying U.S. export controls. The phone became a symbol of China's resilience and sold out nationwide, further displacing iPhone sales in major cities. Xiaomi, once seen as a mid-range alternative, has now climbed into premium smartphone territory and expanded aggressively into smart home and consumer electronics. Meanwhile, BYD, Build Your Dreams, has become China's top electric vehicle, EV manufacturer, outselling Tesla in China by a wide margin in Q2 2024. BYD's market share soared to 35% domestically, supported by vertical integration and a robust domestic supply chain. This shift comes as Chinese consumers rally behind local brands, driven by a mix of nationalism, competitive pricing, and rising quality standards. Many initiatives in China receive state subsidies and central planning on unprecedented levels. For Made in China 2025, and the more recent New Quality Productive Forces strategy, China has handed hundreds of billions of yuan to support industries in advanced manufacturing, semiconductors, electric vehicles, and green energy technologies. In total, more than $280 billion was directed in 2023 for strategic sectors via credit lines, tax breaks, and direct subsidies. SMIC and BYD rapidly scaled production, innovated onshore, and decreased reliance on U.S. technologies, all the while increasing exports to Global South partners. Even with the impact of tariffs and the entire trade realignment, China's GDP was recorded to grow by 5.2% year-on-year in 2023, according to statistics from the National Bureau of Statistics. This performance was above analyst expectations and outstripped most of the major economies. Domestic consumption, industrial upgrades, and export increases to Belt and Road countries cushioned the shock from the trade war. While U.S. brands try to regain access to the Chinese market, Beijing's national champions are not just replacing their foreign competitors at home, they are preparing to take their place globally. De-dollarization accelerates. China has significantly accelerated its de-dollarization strategy, aiming to reduce its dependence on the U.S. dollar in international trade and finance. This movement gained momentum following Washington's use of financial sanctions as a foreign policy tool, particularly during trade tensions and geopolitical conflicts. In 2023, the People's Bank of China, PBOC, ramped up efforts to internationalize the yuan, striking bilateral agreements to settle trade in local currencies with over 25 countries. By early 2025, nearly 30% of China's global trade was being conducted in yuan, up from just 15% in 2020, marking a major shift in the global currency landscape. One of the biggest milestones came when China and key energy partners, including Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Iran, agreed to settle a portion of oil and gas contracts in yuan instead of U.S. dollars. This undermined the long-standing petrodollar system that has historically supported the dollar's global dominance. In 2024, China also expanded the use of its Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, Beijing's alternative to the SWIFT network, to facilitate yuan-denominated transactions across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This system allows countries under U.S. sanctions or wary of dollar dependence to bypass American financial oversight. This reduction in dollar reliance has also been translated into reserves held by the central bank. The steady decline in U.S. Treasury securities holdings by the State Bank of China was realized in over USD 1.1 trillion as of 2013, to be made below USD 800 billion by the end of 2024, accompanied by reserves in gold, euros, and strategic commodities. In addition, the ongoing emergence of a digital yuan into the ECNY has contributed a new strand to China's lure of currency diplomacy. Already implemented in around 25 cities nationwide, the digital yuan has begun piloting cross-border trials with participating countries in the Belt and Road Initiative, providing a state-backed digital alternative to SWIFT or dollar clearing systems. These have raised the level of concern about the United States economy and policymakers. Although approximately 58% of foreign exchange reserves in the world would still be dollar-denominated by IMF estimates in late 2024, that share has been shrinking. China's efforts, together with similar initiatives by Russia and Brazil and other BRICS nations, add up to an emerging de-dollarization bloc, as some analysts have termed it. Total dollar displacement seems quite impractical in the immediate future, but it trends towards a multipolar currency world where no single currency dominates in financial power. This possible development for the United States could potentially imply less leverage in global financial decisions, and higher cost borrowing due to decreased demand for dollar-denominated assets. Wall Street bleeds. In early 2025, Wall Street took a nosedive after China implemented a sweeping wave of retaliatory sanctions and trade restrictions targeting American industries. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell over 750 points in a single trading session, while the S&P 500 dropped 2.1%, marking one of its steepest declines since late 2023. The market reaction came immediately after China expanded its blacklist to include major U.S. firms in the tech and defense sectors and imposed a new round of tariffs on U.S. agricultural and manufacturing exports. Investors, already rattled by ongoing inflation and interest rate uncertainty, were spooked by the rapid escalation of the U.S.-China trade conflict. The tech-heavy Nasdaq was hit particularly hard, with major losses from companies like Apple, Nvidia, and Micron. Apple's stock slid by over 3% after reports that Chinese state agencies had banned the use of iPhones and other US-made devices among government staff. This policy shift threatened Apple's access to its second-largest global market, where it generated roughly $74 billion in revenue in 2023. Semiconductor stocks also declined sharply amid fears that China would expand its ban on American chipmakers and further restrict access to rare earth materials essential to production. It also affected the financial sector. The shares of J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Citigroup were falling, while many worries began to surface concerning possible disruptions of global capital flows and trade finance operations. A 0.4% downward adjustment in the U.S. GDP growth forecast for 2025 was undertaken by the analysts at Goldman Sachs due to possible fallout effects of prolonged U.S.-China tensions over their economies. Investor mood soured further due to signs that China would start selling off its positions in U.S. Treasury bonds, a move likely to shake the bond markets and push the long-term interest rates higher, thereby compounding the fears of economic slowdown. Market analysts and economists now warn that the growing sanctions war between the U.S. and China could inflict long-term structural destruction on the world's economy. As these two nations weaponize trade and capital flows, it increasingly becomes tough for companies to forecast revenues and manage supply chains. Investors are moving from equities to gold and U.S. Treasury securities because of this volatility. This would apparently raise tensions on Wall Street, with every policy move coming from Beijing or Washington having the potential to trigger the market for fresh rounds of turbulence in the absence of a diplomatic breakthrough. This was not just blood for Wall Street indices. A virulent spike in volatility measures was also produced. The so-called fear gauge of the market, the CBOE Volatility Index, VIX, saw an increase of more than 35% in a matter of hours, and its levels then had not been seen since the regional banking crisis of 2023. Trading volumes increased as institutional investors scrambled to rebalance portfolios, hedge funds rushed into defensive plays, and retail investors fled to safety from high-risk assets. Meanwhile, margin calls rose across brokerage platforms to liquidity force leveraged positions and aggravated the downturn in price in a domino effect. The abrupt and rapid downturn has demonstrated just how exposed the global markets still are to geopolitical shocks, in particular those involving the world's two economic giants, the United States and China. But as markets crumbled, the real panic wasn't on Wall Street. It was inside America's boardrooms. U.S. CEOs panic over China market loss. The escalating trade war with China has sent shockwaves through U.S. boardrooms as major corporations face mounting financial losses and long-term market disruption. Industry giants like Apple, Qualcomm, and Boeing, all heavily dependent on Chinese revenue and supply chains, have sounded the alarm, urging the White House to dial back its hardline stance. In early 2025, executives from these companies reportedly reached out to top U.S. trade officials and the National Economic Council, warning that continued hostilities with Beijing could inflict permanent damage on their global competitiveness. The numbers are grim. In less than 10 days following China's announcement of expanded sanctions and retaliatory restrictions, over $90 billion in U.S. market value was wiped out across the tech and aerospace sectors. Apple's stock plunged after China's Ministry of State Security expanded a ban on iPhones in government offices and SOEs, state-owned enterprises, a policy already in place since 2023. Qualcomm faced a similar blow after Beijing suspended approvals for its next-generation chip licenses, while Boeing saw orders for several aircraft frozen amid rising geopolitical tensions. The Business Roundtable survey from Q1 2025 found that 62% of executives at the top U.S. companies viewed the current policy toward China as being economically suicidal. The same survey pointed to fears held by Fortune 500 companies of being excluded for the long term from the world's #2 economy. For its part, China contributed over 15% to Apple's net revenue in 2023 and continues to be important for Qualcomm's mobile chips and Boeing's commercial aircraft. If these companies should lose access to or face serious operational disruptions in China, they may have no choice but to reorganize their global operations, push back product launches, and raise prices for consumers. Wider suspicions among U.S. business leaders suggest that political rhetoric is taking over from economic strategy. Many of them have keenly kept their heads down in private, frustrated that Washington's aggression through sanctions now ignores the real-life existence of global supply chains and interdependence. U.S. firms can also risk being eliminated from future growth corridors as China builds its trade ties in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. The longer the deadlock lasts, the higher the risk escalates of having investors lose confidence and move their capital out of China, thus harming job creation in the United States. With markets unsteady and earnings outlooks trimmed, it has come down to the White House to decide whether to change course or watch its own trade policy drive another recession. China strengthens global trade, isolates U.S. As the U.S. escalates its trade war and sanctions strategy, China is actively reshaping its global trade network to reduce dependency on American markets and isolate the U.S. from emerging economic alliances. A major turning point came with the expansion of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, the world's largest trade bloc, which China leads alongside 14 Asia-Pacific nations, including Japan, South Korea, Australia, and ASEAN countries. In effect, since 2022, RCEP covers about 30% of global GDP and has enabled China to deepen regional supply chains while sidelining the U.S., which is not a member. At the same time, China is advancing the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, with renewed focus. Over 150 countries have now signed BRI cooperation agreements, including new partnerships in the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. In 2024, China finalized major infrastructure and energy deals with Argentina, Kenya, and Pakistan, expanding its economic footprint while offering favorable lending terms without Western political conditions. The China-Arab States Summit also saw a surge in yuan-denominated trade agreements, particularly in oil and construction sectors, weakening U.S. influence in the region traditionally tied to dollar-based trade. China has also moved swiftly to fill the vacuum left by the U.S. withdrawal from multilateral trade agreements. With Washington having exited the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, under Trump, China stepped up its bid to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, signaling its readiness to lead global trade reform. Simultaneously, it signed a landmark free trade agreement with Ecuador in 2023 and launched negotiations with the Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC, further anchoring its presence in global trade without U.S. involvement. These efforts have yielded fruits. In 2023, China overtook the U.S. to become the largest trading partner of the EU, with bilateral trade valued at over $857 billion. China has also maintained its status as Brazil's largest trading partner for the 14th consecutive year, while trade with Russia in 2023 peaked at $240 billion, primarily in yuan. The message is clear. China is not merely decoupling from America, but rather setting up an alternative global economic system. The U.S., on the other hand, appears to be facing isolation as it loses more opportunities in connecting with the rest of the world in view of a multipolar direction. China is also deploying state-sponsored digital infrastructure to cement its trade dominion and reduce dependence on Western financial systems. The launch and the increasing heft of the digital yuan, eCNY, China's central bank digital currency, CBDC, have been instrumental in enhancing cross-border trade, especially with partner nations under the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. By 2024, the digital yuan had been used within different pilot trade zones for settlements with nations in projects such as the United Arab Emirates, Thailand, and Kazakhstan. This technology affords transactions that are faster, safer, and more transparent, circumventing the traditional SWIFT banking systems heavily controlled by the U.S. and its allies. By using eCNY in global trade, China is not only improving its financial sovereignty, but also providing an attractive alternative for countries that are wary of U.S.-led sanctions or financial surveillance. This further isolates the U.S. from the emerging international trade and finance ecosystem. Taiwan, tensions escalate amid trade war. As U.S.-China trade tensions spiral, the Taiwan Strait has once again become a geopolitical flashpoint, adding military risk to already volatile economic conditions. In early 2025, China launched large-scale military exercises surrounding Taiwan, involving dozens of warships, fighter jets, and ballistic missile units. These drills, described by Beijing as combat readiness patrols, came just days after a high-level U.S. delegation visited Taipei and signed a new defense cooperation framework. The exercises, which simulated blockades and amphibious assaults, were the largest since August 2022, when then-House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit triggered a similar military escalation. The situation intensified further following a major U.S.-Taiwan arms deal finalized in late February 2025, which included over $2 billion in advanced missile systems, surveillance drones, and coastal defense platforms. Beijing condemned the deal as a violation of the One China policy and issued direct warnings to Washington, threatening strong countermeasures. In response, China imposed targeted economic sanctions on several U.S. defense contractors, including Lockheed Martin and Raytheon Technologies. The Chinese Foreign Ministry also hinted at expanding its military presence in the South China Sea and increasing pressure on U.S. allies in the region, such as Japan and the Philippines. Global financial markets reacted swiftly to the heightened tensions. The Asia-Pacific risk premium rose sharply as investors sought safer assets. Taiwan's benchmark stock index, the TAIEX, dropped over 3% in a single day amid fears of military confrontation, while the Japanese yen and gold surged as traditional safe havens. Shipping insurers raised rates for vessels navigating the Taiwan Strait, a key choke point for global semiconductor and electronics trade. With over 40% of global container traffic passing through nearby waters, and Taiwan responsible for over 60% of global chip production. Via TSMC, any instability in the region has immediate global economic implications. Economists and geopolitical experts caution that the Taiwan question might elevate from a regional standoff to a global crisis when existing trade conflicts come into play. The US-China decoupling in tech and trade has already wreaked havoc on the supply chain for all commodities, whilst the military tension around Taiwan adds to that risk. Increasingly, Beijing appears to be linking Taiwan to a broader struggle against US economic and military influence, with analysts at the Eurasia Group and Rand Corporation believing that the Taiwan Strait may evolve into a major pressure point for not just East Asia, but for the global economy itself. The world watches on nervously as both sides dig in. Xi Jinping's message to the world. In a high-stakes address to the United Nations General Assembly in late 2024, Chinese President Xi Jinping issued a pointed rebuke of U.S. foreign policy, denouncing what he called economic coercion and hegemonic bullying. Without naming the U.S. directly, Xi condemned the use of unilateral sanctions, trade blackmail, and technology blockades aimed at suppressing China's rise. He called on the international community to oppose the politicization of trade and technology, and emphasized that global rules should not be rewritten by any one country. The speech, delivered at a moment of heightened US-China tensions, was widely interpreted as a direct challenge to Washington's leadership in global affairs. In the home country, Xi is well received with his rhetoric among the public. No sooner had he made the speech than the nationalistic populace jumped into Weibo and Douyin with trending hashtags that read, "We support our country," and "Reject US brands." Chinese consumers are now initiating grassroots boycotts of American companies like Apple, Starbucks, and McDonald's, brands that are regarded as icons of American infidelity. Over 70% of respondents from surveys conducted by the China Youth Daily and Global Times were in favor of all approaches that would deprive Americans of products, even if such inconveniences lasted for a short period. The message put forth by Xi was so crucially assisted by China's state media. Coordinated coverage by CCTV, Xinhua, and China Daily came out with the slogans, "Resilience, not retaliation. China will not be intimidated." The editorials tend to present China as a responsible power defending multilateralism and fairness, while depicting the US as a declining empire clinging to an outdated dominance. International broadcasting, including op-eds in English, targeted emerging markets in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia as part of a wider public diplomacy strategy aimed at trying to woo the global South. Mixed global responses followed. While allies of the U.S. stuck to Washington's policies, sympathy for Beijing's position is growing in many developing nations, especially those with problems with Western-led institutions. Think tank analysts from the Carnegie Endowment and Chatham House said that the way Xi interpreted economic sovereignty would be amiable to those states with their own concerns about dollar-based sanctions or Western investment conditions. Outside the Western bloc, as China's economic and strategic engagements grow, Xi's rebuttal may start a new deliverance order, where Beijing would paint itself as the representative of the global majority fighting back against unilateral dominance. But while Xi rallied the world on the global stage, U.S. media painted a very different picture, one that's starting to crack under the weight of reality. How U.S. networks downplay China's strike. As the U.S.-China trade war intensifies, mainstream American media, particularly right-leaning outlets like Fox News, have been accused of minimizing the economic and geopolitical impact of China's retaliatory moves. Commentators repeatedly assert that China will back down, echoing claims that Beijing's economy is too fragile to endure a prolonged standoff. However, these narratives often contradict actual developments, including China's escalating sanctions, the strengthening of its domestic tech sector, and the country's continued economic growth. This gap between media messaging and on-the-ground realities is raising serious concerns among economists and foreign policy experts. It's becoming increasingly obvious, even to independent analysts, that a media distortion is at work. Reports by think tanks such as those by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Brookings Institution, and CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies, thus maintain that the American media concentrate on achieving short-term political gains rather than focusing on long-term economic ruin. For example, while networks in the United States keep highlighting tariffs as being tough on China, there will be news of great job losses in agriculture and manufacturing, or the more than $90 billion wiped off market value nationwide within days that will not find a mention at all. All of these considerations have worked to keep causing a misinformed public, which will therefore fail to provide the political pressure to mitigate effects. The narratives are being challenged in real time through social media in China and abroad. In the case of China, platforms like Weibo and Douyin are adding fodder to content arguing China's strategic countermeasures, while X, formerly Twitter, and YouTube are busy hosting similar content in the international arena. Chinese state media, notably CCTV and Global Times, have also extended their presence in English, projecting Beijing's worldview to audiences worldwide and depicting the USA as an unreliable economic partner. Asia and the Middle East have seen hashtags such as "China will not back down" and #boycott American brands trending, and suggest growing skepticism internationally toward American media portrayals. Thus, this digital counter-narrative is further diminishing U.S. soft power, especially among emerging economies. In many situations, especially in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, China has generally been seen as retaliating against U.S. provocations rather than acting aggressively. The inability of major U.S. networks to show a balanced view could turn out to be very expensive to the American cause in political and economic terms. With the information flow becoming decentralized, the ability of any single media environment to impose a global perception is weakening. In this vacuum, China is laying its claim over the battlefield of narrative and is doing so with utmost skill. Thanks for watching. If you found this breakdown insightful, smash that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and hit subscribe so you never miss an update on the global power shift. And don't go anywhere. Click the next video on your screen for more on how this economic showdown is rewriting the rules of the world economy. See you there.